Great to see you all again. I had to admit, I went to the restroom just around the corner and I saw myself in the mirror for the first time in maybe a week, and I realized, I apologize. When you teach undergraduates, the sort of the grimier, grubbier you look, the cooler you are. But I forgot I'm in a church, so I apologize.
Okay. Let's see. Sound number one.
I then forgot. All right.
You from last week. Okay. Here's how I would. Oh, what's this? Anybody? It's a tree. Great. This is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Yes. And so when, according to one reading, two or more people self-limit, freely self-limit, for the purpose of engaging in relationship, that is to say, to discuss how the implementation of good or evil, of knowledge might be had, what results? Community, yes, and divine image, which inevitably produces creativity, it produces life, right? And we saw this in the idea that for the biblical text, it constitutes male and female, which again is not a statement about gender or orientation or sex. It's a statement about opposition, people standing in opposition who are able to discuss. And when they do that freely, in a self-limited way, God is imaged. We can turn to Matthew 18:20, which states, when two or more are gathered in my name or my character, there I am with them. It's funny to rethink that, because when I was growing up, you always in prayers, in Jesus' name I pray. But there are plenty of times when I was praying not in Jesus' character, you follow? Not understanding that. So we're coming together. Does this make sense as a proposal? Thoughts about that? Questions? Now, Genesis 3 comes, right? What's this? Yes. So I know it looks different, but it's the same tree. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? The fall occurs, the so-called fall, right? Or the fall into the self, when the divine image collapses. This is empathy. This would be a form of narcissism, self-orientation at the expense of the other. As I like to depict it, rather than engaging in conversation, one of the party, notice how they're now feeling. Do you see the difference? That's biblical. Climbs the tree, like I love to do. Ooh, that's a great position. Picks the fruit of knowledge, takes possession of it, and throws it on the other person, which inevitably leads to the proverbial box. We use knowledge to objectify the other. We want to objectify the other so that we can control the other. Yes? And this obviously results in death, both physically, both literally and metaphorically, right? Objects are not alive. And so this is the collapse of the divine image. Does that make sense? Narcissism. Jesus is not being presenced in this situation. I'll turn back to Martin Buber, I and Thou. He gives several examples of how this occurs practically. One is when we use somebody's experience from the past, one moment in their past, and we reduce that individual to that moment. Does that make sense? Some of you have probably had this experience, and it's horrible. You're vulnerable with another person. Metaphorically, you're naked. You expose yourself, and you tell them something that has happened to you or something that you have done that you feel shame about. And we do that because we want to be seen as a whole person. We want people to know that this is part of our history and an important part of our history, but that's not the only part of our history. Does that make sense? Because if you're anything like me, again, I can dwell upon those moments and I reduce myself to that. And what I really want to hear is the other say, perhaps that was a dumb mistake, you should learn from it, but you are not reduced to that, or what a horrible thing that happened to you, and you are greater than that, right? And I see you as a whole person, or at least I try to see you as a whole person. One of the greatest ways to control people is to use their vulnerability against them. And so we use that moment in the past and we conceptualize them according to it, and they become an object of their past. And when that's the case, there is no hope because there is no future. They're trapped in the box that they've been put in. Buber also talks about reducing individuals to a single element of their being. This happens all the time. We are rich, complex human beings that can only be pursued, not possessed. But that which can't be possessed threatens my power, right? So if I can look at your gender, your sex, your race, your orientation, your religion, your age, where you come from, the sports team you root for, I can reduce you to that and say you are X because you are Y. Do you follow what I'm saying? And then I can make a judgment about that person based upon my knowledge of what that orientation, background, geography is according to me. Follow? I am using, again, knowledge to conceptualize people. Make sense? The divine image breaks. Jesus is no longer present. We can use people as a means to an end. They're objects. We can use knowledge, and we're facing this in our contemporary culture right now as we see images coming out of the Ukraine. And the Russian media is saying, what about those images? They're fake. That's right, they're staged. We've been going through years of claims of fake news, alternative truths, et cetera, right? It's always those in power who are able to shape the narrative. And when we shape the narrative, we control the people. That makes sense? Dialogue no longer occurs. Thoughts about that? Questions about that? So our goal then as humans, or if we want to pursue humanity as I understand it, as God intended it, then we are to pursue encounter, or to pursue empathy, or just to pursue conversation. It's really difficult because that means I can't stand at the center of reality, and I love to be at the center of reality, you know that. Otherwise, we're in isolation. That's the practical groundwork, right? This is moving from the academy to the ground. What does that mean when I speak to my kids, right? What does that mean when I speak to a loved one? What posture do I need to take when I encounter a student with whom I do not agree, or a colleague with whom I do not agree? You follow? Does that make sense? Thoughts about that? Questions?
I have a question, but I think it's so interesting that the Bible is recognized as this symbol or act, this group of stories. And so in using the Bible as a way to define the other, we stay right at the beginning. Don't move through all the conversations that happen. And then all of the New Testament
That's right.
When, as a group, when some group wants to use the Bible to identify and maintain the other in a position of being suppressed, oppressed, violated, they do not seem to recognize the discourse that's present in the majority of this.
Yeah, that's right. And you're talking about what's often referred to as biblical truth. That's how it's used. But ironically, it reminded me of this. We have Genesis. This is Genesis 1 right here, and this is Genesis 2 and 3. They're at odds together, and they stand in opposition to one another, but but they dialogue with one another. And if we allow that dialogue to happen, fruit is produced, right? Fruit is produced. That's right. All right. Will God forgive Putin?
That's mine.
That's fine. That's a different one. All right, friends. So we move on. I hope that at least gives us something. Oh, and to your point as well, when we do that, sorry, did I just say no? I just want to make sure. Sorry, I got my magnifying glass on. When we do this sort of thing, we're actually replaying the fall. So as I said last week, this is not a historical event to my mind. This is something that we choose to participate in every single day, participate in or not every single day. And so when somebody says the image of God is human reason, and I use that, as we discussed last time, to subordinate women and subjugate the other, I'm actually participating in the fall, which is quite ironic because for centuries, almost millennia, that was the governing principle, which led to church doctrine that did this. And that church doctrine, to my mind, as I understand it, that is a reproduction of the fall. It's wild, right? Yes.
I don't know if it's the same thing, but I know Brian Stevenson said that we are better than the worst thing we ever did.
Yes.
We are better than the worst thing we ever did.
I really believe that. And I have to believe that because as soon as I don't, then I use that worst thing as a tool against you.
Yes.
Right? And it may be, but that's the challenge, right? That's where forgiveness comes in. That's where reconciliation plays a role. And justice and confession, those are things that need to be discussed, but you're exactly right. And you know this, I know this very well. When somebody harms you, my power is taken away, right? In one form or another. It's about power. And my immediate intention, my immediate reaction is to reclaim my power, right? And I'm going to do that by any means possible. And then we get in this circular struggle, you know, where I climb the tree and I push them out. I take the fruit and I objectify them. And it goes on and on. Okay. The flood. First point, I did put up Atrahasis, which is a Babylonian flood narrative. You may have looked at that. One of the reasons for posting that is for you to encounter this flood narrative and to know that there were multiple flood narratives floating around, so to speak, in the ancient world, right? And so the biblical tradition is building on that older tradition. Follow? Second point I'll suggest is that the biblical flood narrative is not depicting a flood of the entire world, okay? Because even remember that picture of the cosmos from the ancient perspective? It's not around Earth. It's a flat Earth. It's a very different perspective of reality. So it is using a phenomenon that occurred in Mesopotamia quite frequently floods. They were often bad, not like Egypt, where the river, the Nile, raised and lowered on a regular cycle. But you would have sudden rains that would flood the Mesopotamian riverbeds, and it would be pretty damaging. So there were floods in the ancient world. And of course, water, one of the symbols that it represents, one of them is chaos. So when it flooded, we saw chaos ensuing. So the biblical narrative of the flood is a metaphor drawing on popular literature from the time, which reflected cataclysmic events in the culture and in the society. Does that make sense? If we can set aside the historicity of the flood, just as if we can set aside the historicity of the creation narratives, we can begin to probe into the deeper claims that the text is making. Does that follow? Okay. Tell me about the flood. How do you respond to that? Biblical flood. How do we deal with the biblical flood?
Even as a child, we the flood biblical flood.
Huh?
Even as a 4-year-old, I was like, how did you put all those? I mean, it has a portion that even children are disproportionate.
Absolutely.
And that's why I liked it, and I loved the idea of all the animals, but immediately I questioned its veracity, though I didn't know that's what it was doing.
Which is our reaction when God fashions all of the animals and brings them to the man, right? How does that happen? Well, that's right. That's not the issue, right? That's not. That's a great question, and that question should lead us to thinking that's maybe not the message. Yeah.
Well, two things. One, many long years ago, we were teaching first grade Sunday school.
Yeah.
1 year was enough. But we were studying. We had a lesson on the flood, and one of the things was the kids drew pictures.
Yeah.
This one little girl who came to Sunday school every week, and she did this picture, and here is this ark, and the rainbow, and the dove, and then all these things out here. And I said, Maggie, what are those things? And she said, those are all the people drowning.
Yeah.
And that is not the view you get of the flood if you're reading it as then you think,
that is absolutely right. Look at, I mean, these are just a few pictures, right? Depictions of this. So here's the animals coming. They're wonderful. They're 2x2, whatever, 7x7, depending on the version, as we talked about before. Look at that. Isn't that peaceful? You've got some sea people kind of waving, and everybody's chilling out in the boat underneath the rainbow. Up there, the ark landed, and you have tigers and rabbits and lambs and lions all hanging out, right? And then Noah's going to lead them around the world. In fact, what do depictions of the flood emblazon most often? Can you guess? That's a horrible way to put it, but children's rooms and children's Bibles, right? Children's Bibles.
It's the same with the flood and with lots of other stories. And I read today someplace somebody who was arguing that Christ was actually killed on a Wednesday, not Friday.
Mm-hmm.
And with all of those things, I kind of look at it as, and if that's exactly true, and if whether or not the flood is actually true, whether or not the virgin birth was actually true, how does that affect how I'm supposed to live?
Yeah.
And my answer is it doesn't.
Yeah, and I will argue that in fact, if we don't take the flood as metaphor, as myth, then we won't be given insight into maybe how we're supposed to live and follow. So the first step is this. Understanding its metaphor, understanding it is story, myth, what was the flood really like? Let's put ourselves into the story, right? Into the metaphor as we're supposed to have it, because what's going on here is we're covering over the reality of what happened. We are numbing the community to the actual picture of what's going on. I found these pieces of artwork, right? These are the people outside of the boat after Noah and his family gather into the boat and all of the animals. And can you imagine, because we can't comprehend the end of the story unless we comprehend the beginning, which is being safe in the boat and having the agonizing cries or the cries of agony coming to you into your ears as you watch people and animals drown. Like there's not much worse of a death than that. Follow? Agree? Maybe? And then the ark lands and you get out of the ark, and what are you going to see? All these dead bodies. Wrecked landscape. And not just dead bodies, like bloated dead bodies, bodies that have been soaking in water. It's horrifying. It's horrifying. One of my favorite depictions, the Lego example. Still horrifying. And perhaps later, as they're walking across the earth, still horrifying.
Why do you have to search to find that?
It's the brick Bible. It's the brick Bible. Okay. So if we're serious about this, this is genocide, right? This is genocide. We might call it divine genocide. Now, as a myth, as a story, I'm not under the impression that God committed divine genocide. But I'm under the impression that God's trying to communicate something with humanity and how we are to relate to God. And I think it has to go back to Genesis 2 and God's relating to Adam. Does that make sense? Let's contrast the flood narrative with two other Hebrew Bible stories, okay? The first one is Genesis 18. Genesis 18. And this is when, after God appears to and meets with Abraham and tells him that Sarah is going to give birth to a son, then they all go take a walk and they stand over the cliffs, perhaps, and they look down at Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's these interesting statements that God makes. I have to blow this up to read it. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" That should be this is one of the only times, one of the few times that you get to enter into the internal dialogue of God. And God's asking the divine self a question, which means God is not, or omniscient, right? There's a question about it. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. And God decides to. Why does God decide to? Abraham will surely become a great nation. And then, for I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised. So I'm going to reveal what I'm about to do so that Abraham may know the way of God. Okay? The just way of God. Now, knowing the story, what might you think the just way of God is? What's that? Vengeance, that's right. Again, if you're like me and you like to do this because you think you gain power from it, you think the just way of God is raining fire down on Sodom and Gomorrah, right? We propose something different. This perhaps is not that, because we don't know the end of the story yet. Well, we do, but we're suspending that judgment. This is the way of God. This is the just and right way of God. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sins so grievous that I will go down to see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry. Follow that? That's right. And he hears a report. God hears a report. But what's God going to do?
He's gonna fact check.
Fact check it. Check it out. That's exactly right.
And that does not necessarily mean that God will prescribe vengeance.
That's right.
But certainly the people that are engaged in the outcry will evaluate it as a need of vengeance.
Yes.
I think we attribute so much that when you just read the text, and it is not the most readable.
Yeah. And so the way, the just way of Yahweh is one, having heard a report, God is going to go down and check to make sure that it is authentic. Yeah. The second way of, and this reflects, of course, when God goes to Adam, the man, to see what the man will name them in Genesis 2, because God does not know. God has an idea, but remember, this is the anchoring process of empathy. I've got a hypothesis, I need to test it, and oftentimes I'm wrong with that hypothesis, right? And then, of course, in Exodus 2, God hears the outcry, God sees their pain, God knows their suffering. This is characteristic of God. That's the first part of God's justice, the way of Yahweh. The second part is before God goes down to see Sodom and Gomorrah, what does Abraham do? They argue. They argue. Like we could meditate upon that for years, especially with our perception of God according to the Greek perfections, right? God's all knowing, God's all powerful. If that's who God is, no way am I going to argue. I want to preserve my life. I'm going to do whatever that God says. But the way of Yahweh is one who says, let's talk about this. Let's debate. Make sense?
And even in the process of saying, treating every animal and whatever Adam and saying, is this it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It isn't that God is inaccurate. It is that in relationship to the discourse he's created, that he gives the Adam, the guy, I guess, but that human, he gives that human the ability to say something back. It is not that God is wrong.
Well, I don't know. It seems that God isn't right? Because God is proposing a partner and the man's saying that's not the right partner. And in so doing, God is engaging, allowing agency from the man. Let's do this. We could also put God up here, man here, in that Genesis 2 thing. And this is what's going on as God models what it means to be in a relationship, right? I mean, here's an idea. No, that's not a good idea. But it's a good creation, right?
Yes.
But not a good creation for me as a partner, right? And
when we give agency to others, we don't condemn ourselves. That should not condemn us to some kind of awfulness. When you give agency,
Yep.
you create the discourse that leads to
absolutely. And when that happens, then God is manifest in the tree of life, perhaps, in the divine image, and the person of Jesus. And so, and it's not even just, hey, you shouldn't do this, but remember what happens in Genesis 18? What if there's 50 people? God says, okay. And then he's like, well, maybe what if there's 40 people? Okay. What if there's 30? You know, and he keeps going. And again, as I've said before, my patience is very thin in this kind of dialogue, this kind of pushback. But God's like, okay, there's 10 people. Well, sure enough, there's not 10 people. Lot and his family escape, kind of. But there is consequence. Follow? But God allowed for conversation. Next text, Exodus 32. One of my favorites. God is on the top of the mountain with Moses. And God gives Moses the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. And of course, it was the 15 Commandments, as you all know, and one slipped out and became the 10. But then the 10 Commandments, and God says, all right, Moses, go down the mountain. And he starts walking down, and they look down from the mountain, and they see what at the base of the mountain? An idol, yes, a golden calf created by Aaron, the brother of Moses, from the gold articles of the wandering people. And God looks at Moses, and Moses looks at God, and they both look at the 10 Commandments, and then they both look at the first commandment, which says, don't have any other gods. And they might say, well, that's Yahweh. And then they look at the second commandment, and they see no graven image. That's right. And God gets really mad. And so does Moses. Throws down the commandments. Breaking of a tablet in the ancient world means invalidation of the covenant. If you owed money and it was written on a tablet, you broke the tablet when it was paid back. The covenant's no longer valid. God gets really mad. And if you look at the text, God says to Moses, I am so ticked off. I am going to go destroy all of Israel, and I'm going to create a new people out of you, Moses. Now, here's the thing. If I put myself in Moses' position, you know what I would have said? Sweet! The Israelites. But that's not what Moses says. Moses says, don't do it. Don't do it. It's not going to look good for you. It's not going to be good for the people, etc., etc. And the text reads, the Hebrew reads, God listens to Moses' words. God listened to Moses. God relented of this evil thing that God was about to do. That is astounding. Knowledge of good and evil. God had an idea. Now M stands for Moses. Moses had a different idea. And the people were spared. Not without some form of justice. That's Abraham too. Follow? One more. And then we'll turn back to the flood narrative. Amos, one of my favorite prophets. Amos is operating during a period of Israelite history when the kingdom had expanded. It was experiencing great wealth, and society was very oppressive. The wealthy were oppressing the poor. And the wealthy, the politically powerful, the culturally justified their actions of oppression based on the fact that God had delivered them from Egypt, therefore they were part of the elect, therefore they could do whatever they wanted, which of course is a perversion of the Exodus story, right? Which is why we say, remember, 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 because when you forget, you'll start to oppress other people and you'll put them into slavery that you were delivered from. And so God's frustrated. And God says, I'm going to do these things to Israel. And what does Amos do? Amos says, don't do it. Don't do it yet. Jacob is too small. And twice the text says, and God relented. God listened and God relented. Now we have Abraham and Amos, Moses and the man, God, standing in front of the tree of good and evil, or at the base of it, discussing. And fruit in life is produced. Does this make sense? You following this? So then how might one read the flood narrative?
Could you go back and you said that the biblical flood narrative was not over the entire world, which is something that I've not heard. You kind of give us a little bit of more information about that.
Yeah, great question. So I'm reading this as a literary piece that is drawing on historical events, floods, right, that covered what they viewed as the entire world, right? So for the ancient Mesopotamian, the entire world was pretty small. Do you know what I'm saying? They had no concept of what the globe looked like. So for them, it certainly felt like a global flood, a worldwide flood. But in fact, these floods, as we know now, were very small in scope. So the biblical flood is drawing on that. And as a motif, using water and flood as chaos that threatens the created order. Does that make sense? So that there's no real historicity behind it. It is a metaphor so that we can tap into a deeper message that God is trying to convey. Does that follow?
Except, I thought the metaphor that I had always taken from that story was that God wanted to start anew.
That's right.
Because of the people were not doing what they should do. So he basically put everybody in an ark and sent them out. And he said, we're going to start over.
That's right.
Which would imply that it's not just one area, it's all areas.
And so that's interesting because at the end of the flood, God acknowledges that the heart of humanity oftentimes is inclined toward evil. So even starting over was what we might call a fail, if I can be so bold to say.
It's a little similar to the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, it is. It is. Absolutely. It is.
Creating chaos. Of course, if you have a logical mind, which probably isn't the best way to read.
No, it's not. No,
You
it's
think
not.
to yourself, okay, now where was it that Noah's sons got their wives?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And so that's the funny, interesting thing is that we can get caught up on these things. But think about now the flood narrative in light of Genesis 18, Exodus 32, and Amos 7. God comes to Noah and God says, Noah, build an ark. I'm going to destroy the world. Take 2 of every kind, take 7 of every kind, put them into the ark and close it up and everything will die. Because again, we could say, well, what about the fish, right? Or what about the birds? It's not the issue, right? Yeah. Everything's going to die. Everything's going to die. What does Noah say to God? Literally, what does Noah say to God? Skim the text. What does Noah say to God? If it's like the other stories, Noah argues with God. That's exactly right. What does Noah say to God? You're on the right, you're on it. We wish. Noah is absolutely silent. In fact, Noah does not speak until the end of the entire narrative, and we'll get to that speech in a second. But Noah is completely silent. Who else was silent when a big decision was being made? Talk about new creation. Who else was silent? Yes, sort of.
Adam was silent, she was chatting.
Adam was silent when she was chatting with the serpent. New creation. Noah's the new Adam. And just as Adam was silent, Noah was silent. And what happens? There's no Abraham to push back. Well, there's no Adam in this context to push back. There's no Abraham to push back. There's no Moses to push back. There's no Amos to push back. There's no Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane to push back, even though the plan continued on, right? But he did that. He pushed back. There's no you to push back. There's no me to push back. There's no community to push back. And so what happens? Right? This happens.
When the flood meant, the flood meant. I guess I had the ability to have a fully annotated Bible. Every historic fact that we know from the Greek school, I would say that there was some kind of extreme chaos that was pleasing to God, and that chaos was dealt with in a significant way to bring people to think more collaboratively and less isolation, so this did not occur again.
Right. So how would this not occur? So the first thing that happens is the man, or Noah and his family, get out of the ark, and God surveys what God had done, and God says what?
Never again.
Never again. Now, usually when you say never again, it means that this action was what? Wrong, bad, unproductive, unfruitful. You
Didn't turn
follow?
out the way you wanted it.
Did not, would not. Why was it unproductive and unfruitful? Because it was a decision based on, or it was a decision that was outside of this process of conversation, this process of thought, of empathy, of pushing back. God says never again, and I promise I'll never do this. Like, God repented of what God did. Yeah? And then God makes a new covenant with humanity. You're right. And in this context, God says, okay, you're going to do what you're going to do, so now you can start eating meat, which is a pitch for vegetarianism, which I'm not, because I love my chicken wings too much, especially during football season. Nevertheless, that's a confession. Okay, now imagine, so God's like, this was a bad idea. We get that. So when we go to the flood and we give pictures like this, is such an irresponsible depiction of what's going on. This is horrible. It was bad. And again, I'm not saying that this happened. I'm saying this didn't happen historically. I'm saying this kind of chaos ensues when we don't push back. When we don't push back with one another so that God is imaged. How many people do you think are Putin's advisors right now?
What?
Yeah. If I were to push back with Putin, what would happen to me? It'd be done. It'd be done. You see what I'm saying? If I were to push back with Kim Jong-un right now, what would happen? We've seen this happen. Remember when he used the anti-aircraft gun against his uncle? That was brilliant. Right? Chaos ensues when we don't push back with each other and even with God. Now Noah walks out. He doesn't see this picture. Nope, he sees this picture or that picture. And so the first thing he does after he makes sacrifice to God, the first thing he does is what? He plants a vineyard. And the only reason why you plant a vineyard is to make wine. The only reason why you make wine, well, no, but he does get really drunk. Why does he get drunk?
But if you had to wait till the vineyard grew.
Yeah, again, time doesn't matter, right? Time doesn't matter. No, that's okay. That's right. Time, but why does he get drunk?
It's hopeless.
You got it. Why any of us get drunk? It's called numbing. You know how much shame he felt? I numb when I feel shame. I want to lose myself when I don't want to face reality. When I feel like my life is hopeless. You got it. He sees all these corpses. He realizes, wow, I contributed to this. I did this. Not alone, but I did this. I'm going to get drunk. Numbing. Sometimes I think this is actually a form of numbing.
I look at the turkeys are bigger than the people.
Yeah. And then, like any good man who gets drunk, what does he do?
So there's nothing has a better idea.
Well, he goes into his tent and gets naked, right? Again, nakedness as a metaphor. Nakedness as what?
Shame.
Yeah, vulnerability, which can either be our life, right? You've experienced this, being vulnerable with somebody, and it's like, it is rebirth, that's right. It could be rebirth, right? Nakedness, new life, or it can be our shame, absolutely. And for Noah, which one? It was his shame, that's exactly right. And this is one of the strangest texts in the Bible, because it states that his son, Ham, walks into his tent, sees his father's nakedness. I can't tell you how many attempts at explaining this text that are out there over centuries. Sees his father's nakedness, goes out and tells his brother what he saw. His brothers walk in backward and cover up his father. Okay, that's all the text says. Noah wakes up from his drunken stupor, and these are the first words he articulates. These are the first and only words of the entire flood narrative that come out of the mouth of Noah. And what does he say? Do you remember? Yes, cursed be Canaan. First of all, wait, who's Canaan? Canaan is one of Ham's sons, okay? So I can imagine, kind of waking up from your stupor and you think, wait, it was Ham, wait, it was Kent, or when you're angry at your kids and you go through all of the kids' names and even the dog's name before you actually get to the right kid's name, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Your spouse's name, your uncle's name, you can't even get, so he's just bumbling around, cursed be Canaan. May he be slave of slaves, yes? Presumably because of what his father Ham had done. Now, what had his father Ham done? What's that?
So, Father David.
That's right. Saw him in his vulnerable position, but Noah wasn't in the place to be vulnerable, right? He didn't push back. And you know that feeling when people see us in a vulnerable position and we don't want that. Well, for me at least, boy, the reaction is strong. The reaction is strong. You know what I mean? Shut up. Get away from me. And therein ends the flood narrative, kind of. Kind of. Noah curses his son because of his shame, which resulted from his reluctance or inability to push back with God, which resulted in the destruction of the world. Yes? And that text was taken up by people. Do you know who? That text was taken up by church fathers, and they tried to explain why Ham was cursed, or actually Cain was cursed, is because they said he laughed at Noah, or he did other nefarious things to Noah, and that's why he's cursed. And that curse, as the Bible says, the different brothers went to different parts of the globe. And where did Ham travel? Africa. That's right. And that curse is a legitimate, even though Noah was drunk, that's okay, that's forgivable, but it's ordained by God that the sons of Ham shall be the slaves of slaves. It's ordained by God that the people in the African continent shall be slaves.
And the church,
People who said that.
and the church adopted that.
And the church adopted that. And that's everybody from Thomas to a guy I brought up before, Benjamin Palmer of First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans, who was operating during before and after the Civil War. And he refers specifically to this text and says, God has ordained these individuals. Because look, Ham was wild. Ham couldn't control himself. Ham's rational capacities were so backward, or so decayed, that they have to be slaves, otherwise they'll run wild. And so God has ordained the South, spoke Reverend Palmer, to maintain the institution of slavery for the benefit of the sons of Ham.
So when Noah shouted out Canaan, that was really a mistake. He was really talking about Ham.
Well, yeah. Essentially, I mean, that's how people then read it, because then the Hamites drive south into Africa, and then they become the descendants of Africans. And then people pick this text up. And here's what's so crazy about it. People pick this text up, and as long as people were able to use this text in this way, and until others stood up and said, no, that's not how you read this text, that's not how you treat people, the fall of the flood continued to be repeated over and over and over. In this sense, the flood is a prophetic text. It's eerily prophetic. And again, until we stand here and push back, slavery ensues, subordination ensues, subjugation ensues, chaos ensues.
10 minutes.
Thank you. 10 minutes. There's a basketball game. That you're exactly right. As I said the other day, yeah.
Similar things when that's surprised you not that I would say that.
It's a similar thing with women. Because women too were cast as less than on the rational level and therefore should be subordinate. The churches today, we know this, maintain that position. It's not biblical, it's controlling knowledge at the expense of others.
And all it flows from replicated information that we cannot necessarily pass. And
Right.
when you look at the thoughts about slave of the slaves, that is so absolutely intrinsic to Plato and Aristotle.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Rather than they sort of. And for them, it's tied to myth.
And ironically, to your point, the flood is viewed as a historical event in that context. So historically, Noah cursed Canaan, and so historically, slavery is legitimate. So, okay, if we're going to take this as a historical text, which I don't want to, and I won't, then what are we going to do with this genocide that preceded it, right? Well, people were unrighteous. I'm pretty unrighteous myself. Let's hope that we don't have a guy who puts me in a flood, you know what I mean? I'm certainly unrighteous myself. That's why it's really important to me to read it metaphorically in light of these other encounters between God and humanity, to say this is a model for how we need to operate. This is God is. Imagine this. Imagine God allowing a text to be written that depicts God in this way, right? Interestingly, if you
The descendants of Canaan into the kingdom.
yeah, that's the reasonable interpretation.
They're not factual.
But when we want to justify slavery, we point to Ham. But it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't correspond. No, you're right. The descendants of Canaan lived in Canaan, and there was historical animosity between Israel and Canaan. That would make sense. That would be a sensible interpretation, kind of a twist of the knife, so to speak. But no, it's Ham because these are the Hamites, Hamitic languages, seen as being in Africa. Right? Makes sense. Yeah.
Can I say anything about the rainbow? Just curious.
Not necessarily. I don't know to say something.
Well, I just find it interesting that it's more of a symbol of bow. I mean, it's a play on words.
Yeah.
Like the rainbow, but also bow, no longer.
Yeah. Of course, you also know that butterflies see a much cooler rainbow than we do, so it was the rainbow for them. Oh, their field of color vision is much greater, so it's a cooler rainbow. Dogs, however, see a small rainbow. So when God made the rainbow and promised never to flood the earth again, the dog was like, oh, that's a pretty crappy promise.
Well, there were only two of them left.
Yeah, that's right.
I never have seen a dog in the picture.
Yeah, that's right.
Or a cat.
Yeah.
For that.
So that's the challenge, right? That's the challenge. Returning from chaos to creation, returning from or out of the chaos of control to creation of community. Creation of community. And again, it's a daily choice we make. A daily choice I make.
Well, in history, more modern history, meaning whatever, it keeps happening.
It does. Absolutely. I really think you can boil down most historical tragedies to this, to having somebody as a tyrant, making decisions and not having the voice of the other. It's you can talk about community, you can talk, but sometimes also communities are social selves. We'll pack up so you can watch this basketball game. But social, even if you have a bunch of people in a community who think the same, it's a social self, right? It's not a community. So with my students, I point to our friends over in the Westboro Baptist Church, right? It's a social self. There's nobody pushing back. And anybody who pushes back on that community gets excommunicated. And this is where, as hard as it is to negotiate community, those communities that have a variety of voices, who don't necessarily agree on every interpretation of the text, who walk away from a sermon thinking, I don't know, but don't say, well, I'm getting the heck out of here, right? But say, I'm in it for the long haul, right?
But didn't some family members repudiate them?
Who? Oh, Westboro?
Yeah.
I'm sure, but I'm sure they were kicked out, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So they're no longer part of the quote unquote community, right? That's the problem. That's the difficulty, right? And that's where a community of diverse thought, diverse perspective is so rich, so hard, so difficult, but so rich. You know?
We'll have to kick them out a little bit.
That's right. Thoughts, questions?
Seems to me that the pushback is kind of we have such a tendency to get the form itself to create behavior. So when you're talking about pushing back, it's easy to fall into want to win this argument.
Yeah.
This is the debate I'm on that. As soon as you go to that, so,
Yeah, it's good.
so even when you're talking about their church, it's not their winning argument. As soon as you get into that,
Right.
you are your hate. Right?
It still becomes this.
That's right. So that's the next step. It's pushback that is.
Listening, being pushed back upon, engaging in dialogue. When a decision is made in a community that we might not entirely agree with, finding pieces that are good. having the capacity to go back to the past 4 administrations and be able to find 3 good things and 3 bad things, policy-wise. Policy-wise, right? If you can't find 3 good things, I don't care where you land on the scale, on the aisle or on the spectrum. If you can't find 3 good policies from any president in the past, whatever, 20 years, that's a problem. I mean, seriously, I think that's a problem. You know what I mean?
Very much.
What's that?
Like looking for the one good person inside the car.
Perhaps, yeah, that's right. And 4 were found. Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters. And then when God did destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham wasn't like, I told you, what are you doing? He's like, okay, that's what happened. What happened? But those 4 things were found. Minus Lot's wife. I don't understand that story. The color of salt. I don't get it.
You should ask Joe Walker. He had a great interpretation of that story. Did it on Facebook the other day. I can't remember what it was exactly. I would tell you, but it was very interesting.
All right, friends, I know you need to go watch again.
Brandon.
Yeah,
Brandon.
Thank you.
thanks.